Good afternoon. Welcome to the 2016 West Virginia Poverty and Inequality Symposium. I'm Dr. Tracy Luff, Chair of the Sociology Department here at Concord. Poverty and inequality are such important issues in contemporary American society and here in southern West Virginia. I'm very glad we are all here to devote a few hours of our time to deepening our understanding of it. This is the first year we are hosting this symposium, and we hope you will join us in subsequent years as we look to greatly expand this event. Today's event is sponsored by the Concord University Departments of Sociology, Social Work, and Geography, as well as the Division of Social Sciences and the Honors Program. A special thanks to Dr. Lawrence Eppert for organizing our event, to John David Smith, Joe Manzo, and the entire Concord University IT department for their hard work making today's event happen. Today's program will begin with an address by Washington University in St. Louis poverty scholar Mark Robert Rank, titled "Towards a New Understanding of American Poverty." At 1 o'clock, we will move into the foyer for student poster presentations on the topic of poverty and inequality. Books by our speakers today will also be available for purchase in the foyer during this time and after the event. At the conclusion of the poster session, we will be joined by University of Nottingham inequality scholar Richard Wilkinson for his closing address titled "Income Inequality and Social Dysfunction." We are very fortunate and honored to have two such distinguished speakers with us today. Let us begin with Washington University in St. Louis poverty scholar Mark Robert Rank. Dr. Rank is widely recognized as one of the foremost experts and speakers in the country on issues of poverty, inequality, social welfare, and social justice. He is known for his insightful books on these topics, as well as numerous articles in leading social science journals. Dr. Rank's work has changed the study of poverty in many ways. For example, his work has changed our understanding of welfare and fertility, the structural nature of American poverty, and the life course risk of poverty for Americans. Among his many important contributions to our knowledge of poverty and social welfare in America are the books "Living on the Edge: The Realities of Welfare in America," "One Nation Underprivileged: Why American Poverty Affects Us All," "Chasing the American Dream: Understanding What Shapes Our Fortunes." Dr. Rank has won many awards. He has advised members of Congress on issues of poverty, and his work is often cited by major news outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. His research was even recently cited by President Obama. We are so pleased to have somebody with his expertise here with us today to discuss poverty in America. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Mark Robert Rank.
Well, thanks so much for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be with you here this afternoon, and via technology, it's terrific that I can join you. I can see you here in the auditorium, and hopefully you can see me well as well. So what I want to do is to spend my time going over some ideas on how we might rethink the issue of poverty in America. And I'd like to start with a fundamental puzzle and a paradox. And that is, why is it that in America, which is, after all, the wealthiest country in the world, one also finds the highest rates of poverty in the developed world? So whether we look at children's rates of poverty, poverty among working age adults, poverty among single-parent families, and so on, the story is basically the same. And that is that the U.S. has the highest rates of poverty in the industrialized world. Now, there are several possible explanations for why this might be, but the one that I want to develop here today is that a major reason for this has to do with the way we as a society have thought about this issue, and based on that thinking, how we've acted, or better put, failed to act towards the issue. The focus of much of my work has been to lay a foundation and a framework for thinking about and acting towards the issue of poverty in the U.S. And so what I'd like to do here this afternoon is to discuss three of what I feel are the most important changes that are critical in reframing this issue. And the overall basic point that I want to make is that I don't think we're going to make much progress in reducing poverty in the United States until we dramatically shift our understanding of this issue. So the three changes that I want to talk about is, first of all, we need to shift our understanding of poverty from seeing it as something that happens to others to understanding it as something that affects us all. So that's the first thing I'll spend a little bit of time talking about here today. The second change that I want to talk about is that we need to recognize that a major cause behind why U.S. rates of poverty are so high is not to be found in individual failings, but rather to be found in weaknesses at the economic and the political levels. And the third thing that I want to talk about is the moral ground on which we should look at poverty in this country needs to be one of injustice and the need for social change, rather than the all too common view of looking at poverty through the lens of individual blame, which then leads to inaction and a continued acceptance of the high rates of poverty that we have in this country. So my argument is that for us as a society to make a substantial progress in reducing the extent of poverty in this country, a beginning step is to change our understanding of the issue. And I think that this symposium is a great way of sharing some of that understanding in terms of, again, thinking about poverty and reconceptualizing the issue. So let me turn now to each one of the changes that I think are important in terms of reframing poverty, and I'll provide a little bit of detail on each one. And then I want to spend a little time at the end talking about what kinds of things we might think about doing in terms of policy, and then leave time for questions and discussion, because I'm very interested in the kind of ideas that you have regarding this issue. Okay, so the first change that I want to talk about is to recognize the fact that poverty affects us all. And in fact, that was the subtitle of my book that was referred to, One Nation Underprivileged, Why American Poverty Affects Us All. Now, all too often, the viewpoint in the past has been that poverty affects someone else, but not me. That the problem of poverty is confined to certain areas and neighborhoods, such as inner cities, and that I can largely avoid those areas and simply not deal with it. The notion is often one of out of sight and out of mind. And therefore, poverty is simply not high on my list of priorities. Well, the argument that I want to make is that this perspective is clearly incorrect, and that in one way or another, poverty affects us all. And I think there are at least two ways of thinking about this, and I'll talk about each one of these ways. The first is that whether we recognize it or not, we wind up paying a very steep price for having such high rates of poverty. As I mentioned earlier at the start, the extent and depth of poverty in the U.S. is by far higher than any other Western industrialized country, as is the extent of our economic inequality. And as a result, we wind up spending a lot more money on social problems that poverty is associated with. So we end up with greater health problems, family problems, and a less able workforce, and so on down a long list. There was a report that came out a number of years ago by the Children's Defense Fund, and that report focused on what are the costs of poverty in America, particularly childhood poverty. And I just want to read this quote because I think it's very powerful, and it very much reflects the idea that poverty costs us in many ways. And so they said in that report, the children who suffer poverty's effects are not its only victims. When children do not succeed as adults, all of society pays the price. Businesses are able to find fewer good workers, consumers pay more for their goods, hospital and health insurers spend more treating preventable illnesses, Teachers spend more time on remediation and special education. Private citizens feel less safe on the streets. Governors hire more prison guards. Mayors must pay to shelter homeless families. Judges must hear more criminal, domestic, and other cases. Taxpayers pay for problems that could have been prevented. Fire and medical workers must respond to emergencies that never should have happened. And funeral directors must bury children who never should have died, unquote. And when we speak about issues such as homeland security, these are the issues that I think truly undermine us as a nation and our security. So in short, each of us pays a tremendous price for allowing so many of our citizens and so many of our communities to be mired in poverty. There was a study that was done a few years ago that estimated that the costs of child poverty in the US total around $500 billion a year, or nearly 4% of the nation's annual gross domestic product, or GDP. What they looked at is what was the cost of childhood poverty in terms of healthcare costs, in terms of criminal and justice costs, and in terms of having a less able workforce. And again, they came up with what they felt was a conservative figure of $500 billion a year. Now, what we wind up doing is spending our money on the back end of the problem of poverty, which is assuredly a much more expensive approach to take in the long run than prevention on the front end. For example, it requires a lot more money in the long run to build prisons and put people away for years at a time than to alleviate the conditions that lead to crime in the first place. There's a saying you might have heard that goes, it costs more to go to jail than to Yale. And if you look at the cost of going to Yale and the cost of going to jail, you'll see that that's actually true. It's no coincidence that the United States has both the highest rates of economic inequality and poverty in the Western world, and that we also have the highest rates of incarceration in the entire world. In short, each of us pays dearly in a number of ways for allowing poverty to exist at such levels, although unfortunately, we too often fail to see this connection. So that's a first way that I think poverty affects us all. We wind up paying in many ways a steep price for having such high rates of poverty in our country. But there's also a second way of thinking about why poverty affects us all and how poverty affects us all. And that is the question of what are the chances that an average American will directly encounter poverty at some point during their lifetime? Now, I began to think about this question several years ago, and at the time we knew very little about this, but it seemed to me to be very, very important in terms of making an argument for why poverty is an issue we need to address. And what I did, along with my colleague Tom Herschel at Cornell University, is we used a longitudinal data set. It's actually the longest running data set in the United States, called the Panel Study of Income Dynamics. And it began in 1968 and has since followed families, a number of families, 6,000 families, over the course of this time, and has interviewed them every year or every other year. And so it's a real gold mine in terms of looking at economic issues that affect households and individuals. And what we found is that it turns out that a number of Americans are touched by poverty during their lifetimes. In fact, the rate is exceedingly high. So our latest data, which was in the Chasing the American Dream book, indicates that between the ages of 25 and 60, nearly 40% of Americans will experience at least 1 year below the official poverty line, and 54% of Americans will experience poverty below 150% of the poverty line. But perhaps even more surprising than those statistics is the fact that we've also found that half of all American children at some point during their childhood will reside in a household that uses food stamps for some period of time. And if you're using food stamps, by definition, you're also in poverty. So although the users of welfare are routinely vilified and portrayed as marginalized groups, in fact, many Americans will encounter the welfare system at some point during their lives. Now, if we look at poverty from the broader perspective of significant economic insecurity, then we find an even much higher rate of incidence. So in my book, Chasing the American Dream, what we did is we constructed a measure of economic insecurity that included, did a household use a welfare program? Did they fall below 150% of the poverty line? Or was the head of household unemployed at some point during the year? And if we use this measure of thinking about poverty in a broader sense, what we find is that 4 out of 5 Americans, or 80% of Americans, will experience at least 1 year of significant economic insecurity between the ages of 25 and 60, and half the population will experience 3 or more years of economic insecurity. Now, the reason why these percentages are so high is that if you think about it, we're looking over a long course of time, and during a course of a lifetime, many things happen to people, and many of those things that happen are unexpected and detrimental. So things like losing a job, a family splitting up, getting sick, all of these things can happen when you look across a long period of time. And so rather than a risk that affects a few on the fringes of society, it turns out that poverty and the use of welfare are events that actually will strike the vast majority of Americans. Furthermore, there's been a lot of research done that's shown that this life course risk of poverty and economic instability has actually been increasing over time. So if we look at the 1990s and the 2000s, we see that this risk of insecurity has been increasing. It turns out that more and more families, including middle-class families, are experiencing greater volatility and downward swings in their incomes as a result of greater instability in the labor market and the lack of benefits such as health benefits and unemployment insurance. So jobs are no longer as stable as they once were, retirement benefits are harder to get, the safety net has been weakened over time, and so on. There basically has been a shift in risk that's been occurring over this period of time. And the shift in economic risk has been from the government and businesses that once shouldered a good portion of the risk onto the backs now of individuals and families. So that today for individuals, job stability is much less, people are less likely to have retirement benefits, the social safety net has been weakened, and so on. And this is a fundamentally different understanding of the issue, and one that implies that we all have a direct interest in addressing the topic of poverty. And as we all know, self-interest is often the gold standard in terms of motivation. So there's a quote from an Australian Prime Minister who wrote a number of years ago in the London Daily Telegraph. He said, "The odds makers know that the horse named morality rarely gets past the post, whereas the nag named self-interest always runs a good race." And so my first point here is that we need to see poverty as something that affects us all in one way or another, and consequently, that the reduction of poverty is in all of our self-interests. The bottom line here is that we all have a vested interest and imperative to reducing poverty in the United States. So that's the first point that I want to make, and that is we need to shift our understanding of the issue of poverty from one of somebody else's problem to one of it is all of our problems. Okay, a second change in thinking that I think is necessary before we can make much progress in reducing poverty is to recognize that American poverty is largely the result of failings at the economic and the political levels rather than at the individual level. Now, in the past, we've emphasized individual inadequacies as the major reason for poverty. That is, the argument is often framed as people aren't motivated enough, they aren't working hard enough, they don't have enough skills or education, they've made bad decisions, and so on. And that these are the things that lead people into poverty. And in fact, this is the way that we viewed most social problems, that is, as individual pathology. Now, in contrast to this perspective, the argument that I want to make is that the fundamental problem lies in the fact that there simply are not enough viable opportunities for all Americans. Now, it's certainly true that particular individual shortcomings, such as the lack of education or skills, helps to explain who's more likely to be left out in the competition to locate and secure good opportunities, but it can't explain why there is a shortage of such opportunities in the first place. In order to answer that question, we must turn to the inability of the economic and political structures to provide the supports and opportunities necessary to lift all Americans out of poverty. Now, the most obvious example of this is the mismatch between the number of decent paying jobs versus the pool of labor in search of such jobs. Over the past 30 years, the US economy has been producing more and more low-paying jobs, part-time jobs, and jobs that are lacking in benefits. It's estimated that approximately 30% of all jobs today in the United States are considered low-paying, that is less than $12 an hour. And of course, beyond these low-paying jobs, there are millions of Americans that are unemployed at any point in time. So this past month, the Bureau of Labor Statistics came out with their latest data on this, and the percentage of unemployed was 4.9%, or approximately 7.8 million Americans. Of those 7.8 million Americans, 22 million, or 28%, had been unemployed for 6 months or more. Now, these figures don't include 6 million persons that are working part-time but want to be working full-time, and approximately another 2 million Americans who have given up looking for work or have looked only sporadically because they feel that jobs simply aren't available to them. So if we include all of these numbers together, then we would get a rate of unemployment or underemployment of over 10% of the population. Another aspect of this is that the US has failed to offer the kinds of universal coverage for things like childcare, healthcare, and affordable housing that most other developed countries routinely provide. And the result of all this is an increasing number of families at risk of economic vulnerability and poverty. And one way that I've tried to illustrate this situation in my work is through the analogy of musical chairs. So let's picture up here on the stage a game of musical chairs in which we have 10 players, but only 8 chairs available at any point in time. Now, who's going to win and lose at this game? Well, those more likely to lose out will tend to have characteristics that put them at a disadvantage in terms of competing for the available chairs. So things like less agility, not as much speed, maybe they were in a bad position when the music stopped, and so on. And we can point to those reasons for why the two individuals lost out in the game. However, given that the game is structured in a way such that 2 players are bound to lose, these individual attributes only explain who in particular loses out, not why there are losers in the first place. Ultimately, those 2 people have lost out because there weren't enough chairs for everyone who was playing the game. And the critical mistake that's been made in the past is that we've equated the question of who loses out at the game with the question of why the game produces losers in the first place. They are, in fact, distinct and separate questions. So while characteristics such as deficiencies in skills or education or being in a single-parent family help to explain who in the population is at a heightened risk of encountering poverty, the fact that poverty exists in the first place results not from these characteristics, but rather from a failure of the economic and political structures to provide enough decent opportunities and supports in society. By focusing solely upon individual characteristics, such as education, We can shuffle people up or down in terms of their being more likely to land a job with good earnings, but we're still going to have somebody lose out if there aren't enough decent paying jobs to go around. In short, we're playing a large-scale version of musical chairs in which there are many more players than there are chairs available. And the recognition of this dynamic, I think, represents a fundamental shift in thinking from the past. It helps to explain, for example, why the social policies of the last 3 or 4 decades have largely been ineffective in reducing rates of poverty. We focused our attention and resources on altering either the incentives or disincentives for those playing the game through various welfare reform measures, or in a very limited way, we've upgraded their skills and ability to compete in the game through various job training programs, while at the same time we've left the structure of the game untouched. So you can do all the job training you like, but if there aren't jobs at the end of the line, you're not going to be successful. Now, when the overall rates of poverty do in fact go up or down, they do so primarily as a result of changes on the structural level that increase or decrease the number of available chairs. So in particular, the performance of the economy has been historically important. Now, why is that? Because when the economy is expanding, more opportunities, or chairs in this analogy, are available for the competing pool of labor and their families. The reverse occurs when the economy slows down and contracts. Likewise, changes in various social supports and the social safety net will make a difference in terms of how families are able to avoid poverty or near poverty. So when such supports were increased through the War on Poverty initiatives in the 1960s, we saw poverty rates come down. Likewise, when Social Security benefits were expanded in the 1960s and 1970s, the elderly's rate of poverty declined substantially. Conversely, when social supports have been weakened or eroded, as in the case of children's programs over the last 30 years, their rates of poverty have gone up. And so the recognition of poverty as a structural failing also makes it quite clear why the United States has such high rates of poverty compared to other Western industrialized countries. These rates have nothing to do with Americans being less motivated or less skilled than those in other countries, but with the fact that our economy has been producing millions of low-wage jobs in the face of global competition, and that our social policies have done relatively little to economically support families compared to other industrialized countries. From this perspective, then, one of the keys to addressing poverty is to increase the labor market opportunities and social supports available to American households. Consequently, a second important shift in thinking here is to recognize the fundamental distinction between understanding who loses out at the game versus understanding how and why the game produces losers in the first place. Okay, so that's the second shift that I think is important in terms of reframing the issue of poverty in the United States. And let me now turn to the third shift that I wanted to mention and go into a bit of detail on. And that is the moral ground on which we view poverty in America, I believe, needs to change. In the past, our moral perspective has largely been rooted in the ethos of individual blame. That is, poverty is often seen as the fault of the individual, that individuals are largely to blame for their situation, and consequently, that the rest of society bears little responsibility for their plight. The result of all this is an acceptance of the status quo of high poverty and a lack of initiative to address it. In other words, it's your problem and your responsibility, not mine. And I believe that we must change the moral ground on which poverty is viewed, from individual blame to one of injustice. Poverty represents an injustice of a substantial magnitude. It constitutes severe deprivation and hardship. This has been documented in countless studies, not to mention millions of human lives. And as I argued earlier, much of this poverty is the result of failings at the structural rather than the individual level. But what makes this injustice particularly grievous is the stark contrast between the wealth, abundance, and resources of America on the one hand, and its levels of destitution on the other. Something is seriously wrong when we find that in a country with the greatest resources in the world, there are children without enough to eat, families who can't afford health care, and people who are sleeping on the streets. Or that life expectancy in Harlem is less than it is in Bangladesh. And I should note that the gap between prosperity and poverty has never been wider. So there was a very well-known economist by the name of Paul Samuelson who had an introductory economics textbook that goes back decades. And in the first edition of his introductory textbook in 1948, Samuelson observed that if we were to make an income pyramid out of a child's play blocks, with each layer representing $1,000 of income, the peak would be around the height of the Eiffel Tower, and most of us would be within a yard or so of the ground. This was in 1948. By the time of Samuelson's 2001 edition of the textbook, most of us would still be within a yard or so of the ground, but the Eiffel Tower would now have to be replaced by Mount Everest to represent those at the top. Or take what's happened with respect to the distance between the average worker's salary and the average CEO's salary. In 1980, the average CEO of a major corporation earned around 42 times that of the average worker's pay. Today, it's well over 300 times. Adding insult to injury, during the last 30 years, an increasing number of companies have demanded concessions from their workers, including pay cuts and the elimination of health benefits in order to keep their labor costs down, while those at the top have prospered beyond any sense of decency. If we look at patterns of wealth accumulation instead of income, we see a pattern that is even more skewed. So today in America, we find that the top 1% of the US population currently own 42% of the entire financial wealth in the country, while the bottom 60% of Americans are in possession of less than 1% of the country's financial wealth. And while all of these things have been going on, our social policies have continued to give more and more to the well-to-do and less to the economically vulnerable, with the argument that these policies have been helping all Americans. I think a new way of thinking recognizes this as moral outrage. Injustice, rather than blame, becomes the moral compass on which to view poverty amidst plenty. This type of injustice constitutes a strong impetus for change. It signals that a wrong is being committed that cries out for a remedy. A shift in thinking recognizes this and is premised upon the idea that social change is essential in addressing the injustices of poverty. And this is in sharp contrast with the old way of thinking, in which the moral focus is upon individual blame. This has had the effect of simply reinforcing the status quo of doing little, resulting in continued rates of elevated poverty. So the perspective of injustice allows us to actively engage and confront poverty rather than comfortably settling for the status quo of widespread impoverishment. So I'm looking at the time, and I want to leave a few minutes for us to have some discussion on these issues. But just to sum up, the three important changes that I've been talking about with respect to a new understanding of poverty are, first of all, to recognize that poverty affects us all. Second, that poverty is largely the result of weaknesses at the economic and policy levels. And third, that poverty is a moral injustice in a country with the resources that the United States has. Now, of course, the question arises, can we move our thinking as a society towards such a framework. And it certainly would be foolish not to acknowledge that accomplishing the changes in thinking that I've been talking about this afternoon will be an uphill battle. But I don't think we should let that immobilize us, because social change can and does occur. And just to give you an example of that, at the end of the Chasing the American Dream book, I quoted somebody who was in one of our focus groups. And this group was wrestling with the idea of how positive change can come about on a national level. And after a lot of discussion in the focus group, a fellow by the name of Bill had the floor. And here's what he said, and I just read this quote from him. He says, "So what do you do that lets you go beyond the local level?" And I can't give precise answers to that, but I can give a generic answer, and that is organization. I think the history of the country and the world show that in any society at any time there is a struggle between those who want to dominate politically, socially, economically, and control everything, and those who want to live their lives in a broader, comfortable way, but they don't feel the need to own vast amounts. They just want enough. And some call that class struggle. And the only thing that has ever won, the larger number of people win against the small group that controls the money and the power, has been organization. And Mary made a comment a little while ago that she'll be dust before we see major change. And I think that's a mistake. Again, I think if you look at history, what I see is that social change has come very rapidly when it's come, and usually to everyone's surprise. People are always trying to organize, and every once in a while something clicks and it all happens. And I can't explain what it's going to take to make it click. All I can say is that you keep trying to organize. But you look at, Jim Crow was around for 100 years and it collapsed in about 5. The Soviet Union was around for 70 or 80 years and it fell apart in months. And I think there's a very real possibility that things like that can happen. And I don't know when they happen or what's going to trigger them and what's going to make it work. But when it happens, it'll surprise you and it'll be fast, unquote. So that's what Bill had to say in terms of thinking about social change and bringing that about. I think another example where we've seen dramatic change is how we've come to view the physical environment over a relatively short period of time. And as a result of that change in thinking, we've put in place some significant legislation dealing with environmental protections. We certainly have a lot of room to go on this, but we've made a number of important changes. And our thinking has shifted from one of environmental damage and pollution being someone else's problem to recognizing it as a problem that affects us all. And this represents a profound change in thinking, which has led to a profound change in acting. But the change in how we understood the environment had to occur before we were able to act legislation and dealing with environmental protection. So it was the notion that environmental degradation affects us all that have caused our policies and our actions to change. And such a change in thinking is now needed with respect to American poverty if we're ever going to effectively tackle this issue. We need a new framework in which to understand poverty in America and how to go about addressing it. Martin Luther King, I think, summed this up very well with a passage from his last book, which was called "Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community?" And reading a quote from that is the following. He says, "A true revolution of value will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. We are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will be only an initial act. One day the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be beaten and robbed as they make their journey through life. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It understands that an edifice which produced beggars needs restructuring. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth." And that was written in 1967. So let us take our thinking and our discussions on poverty and move it forward. let's engage in the process of transforming the mindset and ultimately the approaches we use to address the problem of poverty in America. The question then arises, which I raised at the beginning of my talk, what might some of these strategies and approaches be? In other words, to go back to the musical chairs analogy, what kinds of policies can we have that would put more chairs in the game? And I've discussed in various places these, and I see that I'm running out of time, but let me just mention very quickly. These would include things like creating and providing adequately paying jobs. That's crucial in terms of addressing the issue of poverty. Increasing the accessibility of key social and public goods, things like a quality education, healthcare, affordable housing, childcare. Those are all important issues in terms of thinking about poverty. The idea of building assets, both individual assets and community assets, is a longer-term strategy for dealing with the issue of poverty. And then certainly having an effective and smart social safety net is another key strategy in terms of dealing with poverty. And I think all of these policies have the effect of providing more chairs in the musical chairs analogy rather than just shuffling people around. But again, to kind of conclude here, for such policies to fully develop, I believe we must change our understanding and way of thinking about American poverty. And so this brings to mind two favorite quotations that I'll use to end my comments on. The first comes from George Bernard Shaw, who wrote, "Progress is impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything." So that's the first quote. The second quote, I think, deals with the importance that individuals and groups such as yourselves can have in terms of creating this change. And it may be a quote that you've heard before, but it's a very important one. It comes from Margaret Mead, who said, "Never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." And so here's what I believe. Just as we looked back in our history and we wondered, how could we have allowed slavery to exist? How could we have denied women the right to vote? How could we have blatantly discriminated against so many groups? I think one day we'll also look back in amazement and outrage at the time that we allowed so many of our citizens to be mired in poverty and did so little to prevent it. That realization will only come about from a new way of understanding and thinking about poverty. And I believe such a change in perception will occur in the future and will lead to a profound change in acting toward the issue of poverty amidst plenty. And when that day comes, our country will truly live up to the promise of liberty and justice for all. And so thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take some questions.
If you have questions for Dr. Rank, if you could just approach the microphone, and he should be able to hear you just fine.
Good afternoon, Dr. Rank. First question I have for you, to set a little background, you teach at Washington University, correct?
Right, that's right.
And I would assume that you live in West County somewhere?
I live actually very close to school, so I'm sort of in an inner suburb.
Okay. My question comes back to trying to tie what you're saying back to current events, and that would be the throwaway community of Ferguson and the issue that the gentleman that was shot by the police officer, it all started with him robbing a store, and I would assume that because he didn't have the money to purchase it. And one of your quotes was, to avoid poverty areas, and it's not my problem. And then you also mentioned that poverty is a failing at the economic and political level rather than at the individual level. So my question is to you is, why wouldn't someone like Al Sharpton, who staged protest within the city of Ferguson, not have moved that protest to a city like Clayton, where the wealth is, bringing this problem directly to the people that could have had the most impact within metropolitan St. Louis? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And in fact, if my recollection serves me well, I believe that there were protests, in fact, in Clayton, which is just a mile or so from here where I'm speaking. But I'm not sure how much media attention that got. But I think you're right that that we need to bring this issue to various communities, and communities that oftentimes have not really thought about the issue of poverty as affecting them. But you know, what happens here in Ferguson affects this entire metropolitan area, and so it's really important, I think, to do what you're saying, which is to make that argument in various communities and to show in various communities that what happens in Ferguson, what happens in other places, really affects us all. And part of that, just to end, part of the problem, particularly here in St. Louis, is that we have a lot of different municipalities, and they all kind of have their own walls and boundaries and things like that, and we often fail to see ourselves as part of a wider community. And I think that's really important here. It's also important in other places in the United States. So thanks for that question.
Hello, thank you for speaking with us. My question is going a little past what you've spoken about today. It's definitely important that we understand why poverty happens and how it interacts with our society. But moving past, once we understand the fundamentals of poverty and the differences between what you spoke about, what do you think is one of the more important changes that will happen after we understand poverty? You gave some examples of increasing benefits and social programs. Would it be more beneficial to spend time on that, or go from the top where the power is concentrated and try to limit the power and redistribute it to everyone else?
Okay, great question. You guys are asking some terrific questions here. How to take this on? I mean, this is the thing that I've spent time thinking about and dwelling on. I think one probably should address this in terms of various ways and various levels. So, for example, I think what's given me some optimism for the future is that, in the current political season, both the left and the right, or Republicans and Democrats, have been talking about the issue of income inequality and economic inequality, and that we need to address these issues. And certainly Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders have been talking about some policies out there to do this, which I think is very helpful. Republicans have some other ideas, but they're talking about the issue. So I think it's important to think about it on that level. But I guess it's also, it's sort of the quote that I gave at the end about Margaret Mead saying, really change comes from a lot of times a small group of committed folks that are committed to making a change. And I think for me, change often begins on an individual level, talking with groups, talking with folks such as yourself, and taking that and going forward. So, I think that we have a lot of research on what kinds of policies can address the issue of poverty. The problem is again, having the political will, but I think the political will is starting to change and coming more towards this point of view. So that's my perspective on it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Rank. Thank you for speaking
Hi.
to us today. I had a question. It was, after the Citizens United case, it's going to be very difficult for someone of political power to virtually win the election, nevertheless make such revolutionary change, such as Senator Sanders. So I want to know, how could the American people go about moving towards this change without, let's say, a president or somebody having to be elected in order to do so?
Well, you raise a good question, which is the issue of Citizens United, and I think this is something that is a fundamental problem in our democracy, and that is obviously the role of money and resources that has really corrupted our overall system. And so I know some candidates have talked about the importance of overturning Citizens United, which I think Citizens United was a very bad decision. So I think putting in place people that are talking about that and that may be able to do something about that would be very important. Again, I would say there's, in terms of just creating change on a local level, there's all kinds of, I'm sure in your community and in my community, there's all kinds of groups that are thinking about these issues and are doing something about these issues. And it's important to encourage that work to go on. But again, it's also important to think about this larger framework, which is that we really need to create some change on the political and the economic level. And that's it's difficult. It's not easy. I don't have a magic bullet. But I know that it's very important to do that, as well as to deal with poverty in the here and now. You know, oftentimes in social work, we talk about the idea of macro and micro practice. And actually, they're both really important. It's important to deal in the here and now with people's problems and issues, but it's important to also change those structures that lead to those problems in the first place.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for speaking with us. My question is a big question people have been dodging around. The political debate. I've heard a lot of people say that they don't think a democratic socialist system would work here. What is your opinion on that?
Well, there's obviously, I mean, the term democratic socialist, the term socialist is obviously a hot button kind of issue. I think if we kind of get away from those terms and we say, well, what do we actually mean by that? I think, you know, Bernie Sanders has obviously been talking about that. And, you know, I think what he's saying is that we're really an outlier when you think about things like health care, child care, affordable housing, these kinds of issues I mentioned. The United States is really an outlier in terms of these. And how I view this is that, you know, we have a lot to learn from other countries in terms of dealing better with people's needs and people's issues. You know, I had a conversation in my class the other day, and we were talking about the fact that, you know, there's some concern about if you institute programs like this, might you have a less effective economy? Might it hurt your economy and make it less efficient? Well, it turns out if we look at countries like Germany or Sweden or other countries, they actually have had a very robust economic economy along with being able to deliver social goods and public goods to a number of their populations. So that's the way that I view it. I view it as we can learn something, for example, from Canada in terms of healthcare and in terms of some of these issues. So I would put it in that framework, and I think actually we're beginning to come around to that sort of notion. But again, as I said, the United States has really been an outlier amongst the Western industrialized nations. And again, I think that's one of the reasons why we have such high rates of poverty.
So do you think Sanders is the best candidate for presidency?
Well, I'm not going to get into that. I'm not going to get into my political. I think he's certainly raising a lot of important issues. I think he's had the effect of moving Hillary to some extent to those some of those positions. And I think that's really good. I think the question that a lot of people have is who would be more effective in terms of trying to institute some of these changes. And I think that's something for everybody to think about and to decide. But I'm very glad that in the debates and in the discussion, we're having more and more discussion about issues such as poverty, which was raised in the last debate. So I think that's a very good sign.
Thank you.
Hi, so I was wondering, how would you say that we, like, as people, like, trying to, like, get this idea out there and, like, restructure our social ideas of poverty, how would you say we prevent pushback? I think one of the biggest reasons for Donald Trump's, like, rise is this conversation that we're beginning to have as a society. So how would you say we prevent pushback from people that even are, like, affected by it? So.
Yeah, great question. And I would say that what I'm talking about is very much would resonate on both the liberal side and the conservative side. So when I talk about self-interest, I'm talking about we wind up paying a lot of money in terms of having such high rates of poverty. That's an area that it has bipartisan support. You want to be able to spend your money effectively. And what I argue and what I argued here was that we're spending all of our money on the back end of the problem of poverty. It's much more effective to spend that money on the front end of poverty. So I would say that. I would also say that I didn't talk about today, but another issue that I think is important is that having such large extent of poverty in the United States really undermines some of our core values. And I don't have time to go into a lot of detail, but I argue in other places that it undermines some of our core American political values like liberty and justice and democracy. It also undermines some of our core Judeo-Christian values as well. Having the extent of poverty that we have in this country really raises a red flag in terms of these values. And so I would say that these arguments hopefully can be made on both the left and the right side of the aisle in terms of the pushback that you might get from people. So thanks for that question. It's a really good one.
Poster session to begin, but if you could join me in giving a really warm thank you to Dr. Rank.
Thanks very much.